Ever wonder, like, what really goes on behind the scenes to make sure that pill you take, that supplement, anything you're using for your health is actually safe and effective?
It's something most people don't think about, really, until maybe there's a problem, right?
Exactly. But there's this whole fascinating world of clinical trials where all that testing happens. And on the deep dive today, we're gonna, well, dive deep into it.
That's right. We're going to pull back the curtain, so to speak, and take a look at what makes clinical research trustworthy.
Because it's not just about, scientists and lab coats doing experiments. It's really about all these processes that make sure the things that end up in your medicine cabinet, that they're safe, they work, and you can trust them.
And we're talking directly to you, the listener here. We want this deep dive to be useful, to give you a real understanding of how it all works.
We've been digging through a ton of material, by the way, for this, like guidelines from the FDA, transcripts from training courses, all that kind of stuff. And we're going to boil it down to the essential stuff, the key insights.
Think of it like a guided tour of the backbone of clinical trials.
Perfect analogy. And we're focusing on three key areas today. The protocols, like the blueprints for the trials, then the responsibilities of the investigators who actually run those trials.
And can't forget about the documentation, making sure everything is recorded properly. Super important.
Huge. And we'll see how those three things all work together to make sure everything is done ethically and by the book, all the strict regulations that are in place.
Right. And we'll really get into why this matters to you, how these processes actually protect your health and well-being.
It's all connected. Okay, let's start with that foundation, the clinical trial protocol. What is that exactly?
It's basically the game plan, right? The comprehensive, super detailed document that lays out exactly how the clinical trial will be run.
So not just like a loose set of guidelines, it's much more specific than that.
Much more. And believe me, having a well-designed protocol is absolutely critical. That's how you get reliable data that actually means something.
And that's what it's all about, right? Getting solid data to make good decisions.
Absolutely. And the FDA, I mean, they emphasize this a lot. I was looking at their clinical investigator training course materials from this year, the 2024 CITC, and they're very clear on the importance of well-defined objectives right from the start.
Which, might seem obvious, but it's got to be more than just, we want to see if this drug works, right?
Or for sure, those objectives, they have to be very specific, directly tied to the research questions you're trying to answer.
So what are we actually trying to find out with this particular trial? That has to be super clear from the get-go.
Precisely. And you can't just give the drug to everyone and see what happens. Another big thing the FDA talks about is having valid comparisons. That usually means having a control group.
Okay, now, control group, that's one of those terms that might not be familiar to everyone. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. A control group is basically a group of participants who don't get the treatment being studied.
Okay, so they're like the baseline, right?
Exactly. They're there so you can compare them to the group that does get the treatment.
Yeah.
And that way you can see if the treatment is really having an effect or if it's just something else, like the placebo effect or just the natural course of the illness.
Because sometimes people feel better just because they think they're getting a treatment, even if it's not actually doing anything.
Right, exactly. The placebo effect is a real thing.
Yeah.
And having a control group helps you separate that out so you can isolate the real impact of the treatment.
Makes sense. So you got to measure that change accurately, which I guess is where those outcomes come in.
You got it. The protocol also needs to define those really clearly. Those outcomes are what you're actually measuring in the trial to see if the intervention is actually working.
And those got to be reliable, too. The FDA is big on that. You have to be measuring the right thing and doing it in a way that's consistent across all the participants.
Exactly. And then there's the statistical analysis plan. That's a big part of the protocol, too.
So that's how they actually analyze all the data they collect, right? To see if the drug is doing what it's supposed to.
Exactly. And they often lay that out in the protocol beforehand, which is really important. Because it means the researchers have to commit to a specific way of interpreting the data before they see the results. That helps prevent them from being biased.
Oh, I see. They can't just cherry pick the data that supports their hypothesis.
Right. It's all about making sure the analysis is objective and scientifically sound.
So you've got clear goals, a control group, well-defined outcomes, a plan for analyzing the data. It sounds like there's a lot of planning that goes into a clinical trial before you even start.
There is, for sure. And the design of the study itself can be pretty complex, too.
Yeah.
You mentioned randomized controlled trials. Those are considered the gold standard a lot of the time.
Yeah, and that's because the participants are randomly assigned to different groups, right?
Exactly. You don't want to end up with one group that's like all young and healthy and another group that's older and has more health problems. That would skew the results. Randomization helps ensure that the groups are as similar as possible at the beginning, so you're really comparing apples to apples.
Makes sense. But there are other types of study designs, right? Not everything is a randomized controlled trial.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole range of them, and it can get pretty sophisticated.
Yay.
The FDA actually talked about some innovative designs in their CITC Day 3 transcript. Things like adaptive trial designs, where you can actually make changes to the trial as data starts coming in.
That sounds interesting. How does that work?
Well, in a traditional trial, everything is kind of set in stone from the beginning. But with an adaptive design, you can adjust things along the way based on what the data is showing.
Mm.
For example, you might change the dosage of the drug, or even who's eligible to participate in the trial. And this can actually speed up the process of finding effective treatments, which is a huge deal.
I bet. So, for those of us who aren't scientists or statisticians, is there a simpler way to think about what a protocol is?
Hmm. I'd say the best analogy is probably a really detailed recipe.
Okay, I like that.
It lays out all the ingredients, the participants, the interventions, and gives you step-by-step instructions on how to conduct the experiment. And that way, everyone involved knows exactly what to do, and you get consistent and comparable data.
Perfect. So we've got our recipe, now we need our chefs, and those would be the clinical investigators, right? The people who are actually
Yeah.
running the trials.
Exactly. They're on the front lines, working directly with the participants, making sure everything is done according to the protocol. They have a huge responsibility.
They do. It's not just about being a good scientist, it's about ethics and integrity, too.
Absolutely. And one thing that really stood out to me is how much emphasis is placed on training and competence. We were looking at this transcript from an annual GMP training for pharmaceutical professionals.
GMP, that's good manufacturing practice, right?
Right. That applies to clinical trials, too. And this training made it very clear that you can't just have anyone running these trials. They need to be qualified, experienced, and properly trained.
Makes sense. You're dealing with people's health here. It's not something to be taken lightly.
Absolutely. And the training covers a wide range of topics, everything from understanding the protocol and the investigational product itself to, like you said, ethical guidelines and data collection methods.
So they know how to conduct the trial properly and safely. But what about when things go wrong? Like, what if a participant has a bad reaction to the drug? What's the protocol for that?
That's a crucial point, and it gets into something called adverse events. The FDA talks about this a lot in their training materials, and they make it very clear that investigators have a responsibility to report any serious adverse events to the sponsor immediately.
Even if they don't think the drug is the cause.
Especially then, actually. If there's any suspicion that the drug could be involved, they have to report it right away. It's all about being cautious and making sure any potential problems are addressed quickly.
I see. And I'm guessing less serious events still need to be documented, right?
Oh, absolutely. Everything gets documented. The investigator has to record any adverse event, big or small, and then report it to the sponsor according to the schedule outlined in the protocol.
So they have a complete picture of what's happening with the participants throughout in the trial.
Precisely. It's not just about finding out if the drug works. It's about making sure it's safe, too.
Mm.
And that means keeping track of everything.
Right. And it seems like there's also an obligation for investigators to be transparent about the trial itself. I remember something about a website, clinicaltrials.gov.
Yes, that's a really important resource. The FDA emphasizes that investigators need to understand and follow the rules for registering their trials on that site. And then, later on, they have to report the results there, too.
So it's like a public database where anyone can find information about clinical trials.
Exactly. And it's really important for transparency. Patients, healthcare professionals, other researchers, they can all go there and see what's going on. It helps keep everyone informed and accountable.
So it's not just about doing the research. Investigators also have to be ethical, keep participants safe, and be transparent about their work.
It's a lot to juggle. And on top of all that, the FDA keeps a close eye on them, too. They actually conduct these things called GCP compliance reviews and inspections.
GCP, that stands for good clinical practice, right?
Right, again. And it's basically a set of international standards for how clinical trials should be conducted. And a big part of the FDA's job is to make sure those standards are being met.
So they're not just trusting the investigators to do everything right. They're actively checking up on them.
Exactly. And that's a good thing. It's another layer of protection for the participants, and it helps ensure that the data coming out of these trials is reliable.
Right. So for our listeners out there, think of the clinical investigator as the conductor of the research orchestra. They need to be experts in their field, they need to be meticulous, and they need to be committed to doing things the right way.
Spot on.
Okay, so we've talked about protocols and investigators. Now let's move on to something that might sound a bit less exciting, but it's absolutely crucial: documentation.
It might not be the most glamorous part of the process, but documentation is the bedrock of any trustworthy clinical trial. Without it, you really have no way of knowing what happened or whether things were done properly.
Right, it's all about accountability and transparency, and it's not just a good idea, it's the law.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big deal. The Code of Federal Regulations, specifically Title 21, Part 211, lays out all the rules for documenting clinical trials. And it's very clear. You got to keep accurate and detailed records of everything.
So it's not just about writing down the results of the trial, it's about documenting every step of the process.
Right. Every single thing. From the moment the materials for the trial arrive at the site to the final analysis of the data.
I was looking at the CFR earlier, and it even mentions that you have to document the examination of the packaging and labeling materials before you use them.
Exactly. It's really about creating a complete and auditable trail.
Mhm.
So if there are any questions later on, you can go back and see exactly what happened, who did what, and when. And, it's not just about recording what went right. It's also about documenting any problems or deviations from the protocol.
So if something unexpected happens or something goes wrong, you got to write that down too.
Absolutely. And you have to investigate it thoroughly and document what you found. This is super important, especially if it involves like an unexplained discrepancy or a failure to meet some kind of specification. I was reading this book by David Bleesner about setting up a CGMP lab audit system, and he really hammers home how important it is to document those kinds of failures and how you address them.
So why is all this so important for our listeners? I mean, why should they care about documentation?
Because it's how we know that the trial was conducted properly and that the data is reliable. Think about it. If there's no documentation, you're just taking someone's word for it. But if everything is documented, then anyone, regulators, other researchers, even the public, can go back and check things out for themselves.
It's like that old saying, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen.
Exactly. Documentation is proof. It's how we hold everyone accountable and ensure that the research is being done ethically and scientifically.
Okay, so we've talked about these three key elements: well-designed protocols, responsible investigators, and meticulous documentation. Now, how does this all tie together to ensure compliance with all those ethical and regulatory standards we talked about earlier?
They're all interconnected, really. Think of it like a three-legged stool. You need all three legs for it to stand up.
Okay, I like that.
The protocol sets the plan, the investigators carry out the plan, and the documentation proves that the plan was followed. And when all three of those things are working together properly, it minimizes the risk of errors, it helps prevent fraud, and it protects the participants in the trial.
And it's not just up to the investigators to police themselves, right? The FDA gets involved too.
Oh yeah, they do inspections, they review the data, they make sure everything is being done by the book. It's another level of oversight to make sure that the research is being conducted ethically and responsibly.
And that's ultimately what it's all about, right? Protecting people's health and making sure that the treatments we're using are safe and effective.
Exactly.
So, to sum things up, we've learned that well-structured protocols lay out the roadmap for the trial, responsible investigators act as the guides, and comprehensive documentation serves as the permanent record.
And it all comes together to uphold the integrity of clinical research.
And that benefits all of us.
Absolutely.
So, the next time you hear about a new drug or a promising new therapy, take a moment to think about all the work that went into getting it to that point. All those scientists, all those investigators, all those people working behind the scenes to make sure it's safe and effective.
It's a huge undertaking.
It is. And I hope this deep dive has given you a better appreciation for the complexity and rigor of clinical trials.
Me too. And hopefully it's also given you some food for thought.
Right. So think about this. What aspects of clinical trials do you find most reassuring, and what questions do you still have? We encourage you to keep learning and to share your thoughts.
And an important conversation to have.
It is. And we thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of clinical trial protocols, investigator responsibilities, and documentation.
Thanks for listening.
And be sure to join us next time when we'll be exploring another fascinating area in the world of science and regulation.
Can't wait.